Let's begin now. Welcome all to the Department of English of Pemraj Sarada College. This is day 2 of our lecture series called Reflections, and we have Dr. Kamlakar Bhat as our guest speaker. He would be talking about his recently published book titled Courtesy of Criticism, which is a collection of essays translated from Kannada into English by Dr. Bhat, and the essays are written by the famous critic, Kannada critic, Kirtinath Kurtkoti. So, without further delay, I would now ask my colleague, Dr. Satyajit Patil, to introduce the speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Today I am honored to introduce you to Dr. Kamlakar Bhat, the distinguished guest speaker for today's lecture series named Reflections. Professor Bhat has been working in the postgraduate Department of English of Ahmednagar College, Ahmednagar for the last 3 decades. He is an accomplished academician and a scholar par excellence. Dr. Bhat is an award-winning bilingual author, a columnist and a translator between English, Hindi, Marathi and Kannada. He has published 4 collections of poems in Kannada. He has, to his credit, translations of well-known Marathi poets Namdev Dhasal and Hemant Divte, besides an anthology of poems from 10 Indian languages. He has also translated Louis Boye, a Spanish name, his rare collection of lectures, This Craft of Verse, into Kannada. Professor Bhat's forthcoming work includes translation of Kannada feminist critic M.S. Asha Devi and translations of 2 Sahitya Akademi Award winning authors, Ashok Vajpayee, and the first Indian author to receive Sahitya Akademi Award, Jayant Mahapatra. It was yesterday only that I was privileged to attend the online launching of a book edited by Dr. Kamlakar Bhat, containing selected poems of H.S. Shiva Prakash, a leading poet and playwright in Kannada, named In the Light of Shiva. Apart from this, Professor Bhat's academic and literary essays have appeared in national and international journals and magazines, including Agni, The Outlook, The Wire, Scroll, Indian Literature, Yapan Chitra, the Bangalore Literature Review, and the Bombay Literary Review. Translation of his essays have appeared in leading Marathi magazines, Abhidhanantar and My Maushi. Dr. Kamlakar Bhat's translation of the pioneering Kannada critic Kirtinath Kurkoti's important essays on Kannada literature, titled Courtesy of Criticism, was recently brought out by Penguin Random House, India. Sir, we would like you to share your enriching experiences while carrying out this challenging task. I think you have translated more than 30 essays, 31 in all, I think. So, may I request you to proceed further with your views. Over to you.
Thank you, Patil sir. Thank you, Professor Madhuri Dikshit. Let me begin by thanking the Department of English of Sarada College for organizing this thoughtful series of lectures titled Reflections, and also grateful that I have got a chance to be a part of the Reflections series. I think it is important because I think this series of lectures, I know the number of all the three titles indicate that these are lectures not strictly related to the syllabus, right? It's not as if they are topics from, we used to have these quality improvement programs, QIPs, in which we would have, topics from the syllabus on which we would have guest lectures. This is something hatke, as we say, which is very important, I think, and I'm sure that is the objective of this series also, that we need to encourage the students to, go beyond the horizon and also push their imagination, push their intellectual curiosity to think about much more than, exams and what is there for the exams and notes and stuff like that. Because it is only when you start ignoring the exams that you will excel in the exams. If you only prepare for exams, you will perhaps not do very well in the bigger exam called life. From that point of view, I think a series of lectures where people talk about issues beyond the borders of syllabus will surely be useful to the students. So I was thinking, how this topic would be of relevance in this series. I forgot to mention that I must thank Professor Madhuri Dikshit for suggesting that I speak on this. It was she who suggested that I speak on this book. This book, as Professor Patil said, was published in December 2024, and it contains 31 essays, like he said, which I had been working on for the last, before the date of publication, for nearly 1.5 years. I mean, the whole project took around 1.5 years to complete. I will share some of the experiences. So I was thinking how this would be relevant to the students and staff of English. And I think that there are two reasons why my sharing the experience of translating Kirtinath Kurtkoti will be of relevance to English studies, students of English department, both those who are present in front of me and those who have joined us on YouTube. One of them is that some of us are taking an interest in translation these days, and sharing my experience might demonstrate some of the issues thrown up in the field of translation. So it might be interesting to engage with some of these issues. And if you yourself are interested in translation, then especially so. But a more substantial reason why we can think along the lines of this book is the fact that I was sharing with them earlier, is that in English studies, I think somewhere in 1990s, Dr. G.N. Devi published a book called After Amnesia, in which he had argued that one of the signs of our colonial mentality is that we have largely ignored the history, the tradition, and the intellectual resources of the Indian languages. And even after 20 years or more than 20 years, nearly, it came out in 1995 or thereabout. I don't remember exactly when it came out, but maybe around 25, 30 years ago, Dr. Devi spoke about it, and things haven't changed a lot even today. Like, for example, if we are talking about English literature in India, and if you go down to the works cited, you're not likely to come across a single non-English source, unless you're a Bengali. If you're a Bengali, you're likely to come across a Bengali source, not any other. Non-English sources are not consulted at all. on English literature, whether it is Indian English literature or European literature or whatever, American literature, whatever. So your PhD thesis, your academic scholarship, etc., none of them reference anything other than what is available in English. This is one point. Another point is that, okay, so the English academics are snobs. They don't consult anybody else. Look at the way in which we talk about Indian language literatures, whether in English or in Indian languages. Even there, if you are talking about Marathi literature, then you will be referring to the intellectual resources in Marathi. And you will be also perhaps referring to what is available in English. This is likely. But you're not going to be referring to the intellectual resources available in Marathi or Hindi or Bengali or Gujarati while talking about Marathi literature. Similarly, if I am talking about Kannada literature, I am likely to refer to English and Kannada, but not what's available in Marathi. So I am not allowing the Marathi intellectual resources to shape my thinking about Kannada, although Marathi and Kannada are mutually constituting linguistic worlds. And many of our languages, for example, Hindi, almost all of us are shaped by Hindi for good or for bad. Who among us can live without a Hindi film song, isn't it? So, irrespective of that, how many of us are in a position to say that we consult the intellectual resources available in Hindi, produced in Hindi, right? We don't. For us, scholarship has been largely English. And this is precisely what J.N. Devi meant by saying that, this is colonial mentality. So, one of the ways in which I thought it would be relevant to people working in the fields of humanities at large, English studies in particular, to talk about this book is in this context. I think it is important. It has started happening. This project of which this is a book, it's a project run by Ashoka University. They have a Center for Translation. They have been undertaking this project of translating. There is one project to translate Sharad Patil into English. Rahul... Rahul... immediately I can't remember his name. He is translating... Sharad Patil. So from Marathi, Sharad Patil's work is being translated, and Kannada, Kirtinath Kurtkoti, and Lakshmish Tolpade, another Kannada. Two works from Kannada are being translated, and from Gujarati something is translated, and many other Indian languages something are being translated. So it is happening, but it needs to happen perhaps more, where we take stock of our multilingual, situation where we are constituted by multiple languages. A world constituted of multiple languages, and we begin to consult the resources available in all these languages rather than only in English. And by and large, that is also the kind of argument that Kirtinath Kurtkoti was doing right from the beginning, from 1958. This whole business, initially I thought, when I first read Kirtinath Kurtkoti, I thought he's basically a nativist. In nativist is a word that we use to refer to those who reject anything from outside world, especially Western world. But in preference for that which belongs only to our country. But the natives are sometimes, are also problematic because they look at this India as having one dimension, single dimension. So if you want to talk about Indian aesthetics, for example, you'll think of only Sanskrit aesthetics. And that is the impression that Kirtinath Kurtkoti also gave, because he talks about Indian Sanskrit aesthetics a lot. But then I began to notice that there is much more than that in Kirtinath Kurtkoti. And this is the kind of argument that he's also making, that this a kind of a monochromatic approach we have of consulting or working only within this single framework of the Western aesthetics and the Western framework of the intellectual trajectory that we deploy tend to be in a way exclusive, whether it is in English studies, and because Ankush is here, I'm every now and then looking at him and trying to expand the frame of reference here, even in other fields such as humanities at large and social sciences at large. So that is the reason why I thought, okay, this is not going to be irrelevant. This is going to be relevant in this context. Now, again, I was wondering how best to talk about this project and this book so that it becomes of some relevance to all of you. Then I realized that the clearest path for me to share my experience would be to talk about three questions. Why did I translate Kirtinath Kurtkoti? So in this lecture, I would like to try and answer that question. Why did I translate Kirtinath Kurtkoti? And how did I translate Kirtinath Kurtkoti? And thirdly, for whom did I translate Kirtinath Kurtkoti? So that is roughly what I would like to do in the course of this lecture. Just to ease into this lecture, let me start with something light-hearted, some anecdotal, aspects. See, I had grown up hearing the name of Kirtinath Kurtkoti as a kind of a legendary figure. There are lots of stories about Kirtinath Kurtkoti in the Kannada circles, and I remember hearing a lot about his memory. That he had a phenomenal memory. One or two instances of that. For example, apparently in 1960s, Bendre is a Kannada poet, actually a bilingual poet. He wrote in Marathi and Kannada. He wrote a play in Marathi also, by the way. Bendre, his name is Bendre. So Bendre had written a play, and that play was being performed in Dharwad. But Bendre at the time was in Solapur. He was a school teacher there. And in those days, of course, the distance between Dharwad and Solapur was considerable enough, and one couldn't contact very easily. So this group that was putting up the play, they suddenly discovered a couple of days before the performance that two of the lines of a song in that play are missing. They suddenly discovered that they are performing the song, an incomplete song. There should have been two more lines. There was no time for them to, contact Bendre and get those remaining two lines. So they asked Kirtinath Kurtkoti, who furnished them the two lines. And after 2 days, when the performance was there, Bendre was present, and when they compared to the original lines, they were exact. And there have been many people have shared their experiences of how they were surprised with the memory of the power of memory that Kirtinath Kurtkoti possessed. S.R. Vijay a Kannada critic, for example, talks about how he was thinking of a particular poem by Dara Bendre on Shiva, about which nobody has spoken about. So he was feeling, elated that he is talking about a poem that nobody seems to have noticed. So Kirtinath Kurtkoti, who always has a pan in his mouth, emptied his mouth of the pan juice into a spittoon and recited the entire poem. Are you talking about this poem? So that was the kind of memory he is famous for. There was a novel that was submitted to Manohara Granthamala, to which Kirtinath Kurtkoti was an advisor. All his life he was the advisor. From his when he was 28. From that age till he died in 2013, he was the advisor to this Manohara Granthamala. So one of the novels by a very famous novelist who wrote this novel called Faniyamma, which was made into a film which won the national award and all that, M.K. Indira. So she had submitted a novel to Manohara Granthamala, and being the advisor, he would read all the novels. And because he was working in Anand, these novels were also in transit with him whenever he moved from Dharwad to Anand. And on one such occasion, the manuscript got lost. So after some time, it was discovered that the manuscript is not to be found. And apparently, when they got back to M.K. Indira and she didn't have another copy, Kirtinath Kurtkoti, I don't know how far it is true or false, but the legend says that Kirtinath Kurtkoti wrote the entire novel again from memory, and M.K. Indira was completely okay with it. But of course, these are all about legends. We don't know to what extent it is true. But people who, I have never heard him myself, I have never seen him, I have never met him. But people I have met, in fact, recently I was in SP University where he was teaching in Gujarat. Even there, have repeatedly told me the extent of his memory. Like, for example, very commonly in Kannada circles, you come across people saying, the moment you mention Kirtinath Kurtkoti, they would say, he would recite entire passages from the epic poem of Kumaravyasa. And apparently, he didn't need a text. He would just simply sit without any text, and he would recite lines of poetry from ancient Kannada, from medieval Kannada, from Sanskrit, from English, from Marathi, etc., etc. Such phenomenal memory he had. In fact, Gopal Krishna Adiga, another well-known Kannada modernist poet, is supposed to have said that he is cursed with an accurate memory, which is both a blessing and a curse in a way. So there are many such legends about Kirtinath Kurtkoti. One of the other legends, is about how he shaped Girish Karnad into a great playwright. The story is that Karnad himself, in his autobiography, writes about it, and elsewhere, not only in autobiography, in other places also he has written it. He has written this, that when he wrote Yayati, and he showed it to Kirtinath Kurtkoti, Kirtinath Kurtkoti almost entirely rewrote it. Every line of it he apparently rewrote. And I have quoted on the very first page of this book, it is quoted how Girish Karnad says, reading Kirtinath Kurtkoti's essays changed the course of my life. And there are many others who have said something similar. There is a very well-known Kannada realist novel called Gramayan by a writer called Rao Bahadur. It's somewhat like, the Marathi novelist Anand, rural novel प्रकार है ना मराठी का, रूरल नॉवेल्स, उसका जो ग्रामीण कादम्बरी का Anand, he was Anand Yadav, somewhat like that, Rao Bahadur is of that kind. And his novel, Gramayan, a fairly large novel, is another such instance. He played an Ezra Pound to Girish Karnad, Rao Bahadur, and a number of others, Chandrasekhar Kambar, for example. So these are all the legends one hears about Kirtinath Kurtkoti, and this was one of the reasons why Kurtkoti was always on my mind before I really started reading his works. Now, another is what you were earlier talking about. In Manohara Granthamala, I went there in Dharwad. Manohara Granthamala they are a publisher. So they're not really a bookshop. It's a publisher's office. So on a commercial street in Dharwad, very close to the bus stand, they have an office on a two-story building on the first floor. Ground floor is a tailor, and next to the tailor is a flight of stairs. You go up, and There's a small office, not very big, perhaps as big as this room. All their publications, lined up. So this was called as Atta. Atta basically means attic. So on this, in this office, the legend goes that there would be every evening, whenever Kirtinath Kurtkoti is in Dharwad, every evening there would be a literary conversation. So people would gather and they would talk and talk and talk about literature. And who would do the talking? Most of the times it was apparently Kirtinath Kurtkoti. And he had this great passion to talk about literature. He talked only about literature and always about literature. That's another thing. It's not about, like we talk about, Modi Saab and this and that. Lots of, our education, this thing and unemployment. Lots of things we want to talk about, films or whatever, reels and stuff like that, right? Good, bad and the ugly of our living. But he had no interest in talking about anything other than literature. If we talked about anything, it would be through literature. So that was the kind of person he was. He was very passionate about literature. So on these occasions in Manohar Granthamala attic, he would kind of hold forth. He would have this darbar, literary darbar, where he would go on and on and on, and of course, others engage others also in conversation. And many people, both eminent writers like Anantamurthy, D.R. Nagaraj, and a host of others, S.R. Vijay Shankar, whom I referred to earlier, and others have talked about their experience of being in the presence of Kurtkoti in this attic and how he, would be filled with this great enthusiasm for literary conversations. I say this specifically because it says something about his approach to literary criticism. For him, literary criticism, as I'm going to perhaps say this later more emphatically, for him, literary criticism was not so much a very logical prose, or magisterial exercise of evaluating, but primarily an enthusiastic sharing of literary experience. And this is something very, very significant, I feel. Now, he another very important and very significant aspect of Kurtkoti is this, that I've always wondered why in India we have so few multilingual scholars. Now, who is a multilingual scholar? A multilingual scholar is not merely somebody who knows multiple languages. I know 4 or 5 languages. I have some smattering of familiarity with Marathi literature, a smattering of familiarity with, if you don't ask. If you ask, I may not know anything about Marathi literature, but a smattering, a little bit of familiarity with Marathi literature, a little bit of familiarity with Hindi literature, etc. But I'm not a multilingual scholar because I can't really talk about Marathi literature, or I cannot talk about any literature by referring to or comparing with Marathi literature, etc. A multilingual scholar is one who will be able to, operationalize his familiarity with multiple language resources. And there are very, very few of that kind in India, although so many of us are multilingual. All of us know multiple languages, but how many of us have, expertise in multiple languages? Okay, English and Marathi, maybe. That is likely the case. Bilingual, yes, not multilingual. He was one of the very rare scholars who was a multilingual, where he knew Marathi, he knew Sanskrit, he knew English, he knew Gujarati, he knew Hindi. And I'm not saying that he knew these languages. He knew the literature in all these languages. So he was also very well versed in Marathi literature and Marathi theatre. In his writings, he talks about XYZ performances. Not only Marathi drama, but this performance by so and so. He talks about Balgandarva, he talks about that performance, and so on and so forth. Now, this is very important, and we realize when we read him how I'll give you some examples a little later. Now, one of the significant things about him is that he lived a multicultural life. Let me read something that he says. In our hometown of Kurtkoti, at our uncle's house, there was a collection of over 10,000 books. There, without any effort, I would read Dickens's novels alongside Bana's stories. Bana Bhatta, the Sanskrit writer. Kalidasa's Raghuvamsha, and many more. In Gadag, I would finish reading the books at Sri G.B. Joshi's Jivana Pustakalaya, the bookshop called Jivana Pustakalaya, before they were even sold. There's others. Whether it was someone's speech, a folk song, the play performed by Siddaramaya of Handiganuru during bankruptcy, the annual village festival programs, or recitation of Mahabharat, there was no escape from this cultural immersion. So, right from the beginning, his upbringing itself was multicultural. Sanskrit, Marathi, Kannada, both ancient and modern Kannada. And he was English. And he was, brought up on reading all this. Just imagine reading. If you come to my house, you will see that I have an impressive library. Even though I am saying it myself. But like we were saying in the session, before the session started yesterday, there are a couple of people sitting in that online program we had yesterday, and their backdrop was a library. So I just remarked, you have a fantastic library at the back. And the person, this lady called Zingonia, she said, but I haven't read all of them. That is the case with most of us. We line up our bookshelf with lots of books, but we don't always manage to read all of them. But I think one exception to this was Kirtinath Kurtkoti. He literally had read all the books, we are told, in Jivana Pustakalaya and elsewhere. And this is something that his own writing, proves to us also. So this is again important because he is inherently and inescapably comparative and multilingual. That comparison is also multilingual. He cannot talk about any literature. He has written about Kannada literature, he has written about English literature, he has written about Sanskrit literature in great detail. And when writing about any of this, he would be bringing in Marathi, he would be bringing in Gujarati, he would be bringing in some Hindi, etc. And others through, translation. He may have read Bengali, for example. He talks about Bengali, he talks about French, German literatures and all that, which he perhaps has read in translations. So I think these are all very, very significant. So, now, I say that the purpose of translating Courtesy of Criticism, these essays, is to introduce primarily Kannada literature to non-Kannada readers, but most importantly, literary criticism in Kannada to non-Kannada readers, which is what, like I was saying earlier, is a very important requirement today, where we need to be in a position to consult. Whether we write in English or in Marathi, that is secondary. But even when we are writing in English or even when we are writing in Marathi, we should be able to know what people in Kannada have said, what people in Hindi have said, what people in Telugu have said, what people in Gujarati have said, so on and so forth. So that then we are in a position to, I think, approach the multilingual condition of these texts. I'll give you one example to prove that this is so. You see, there is this word, when you talk about Sanskrit drama or drama in Indian languages, there is this word called Sutradhara, right? And a Sutradhara is the narrator. Very often in Sanskrit drama, there is a narrator who comes and says, falana, falana, etc. And he's called Sutradhara. I had always thought, and most of us assume, that Sutradhara refers to somebody who holds the sutra. Now, where does that image come from? The puppetry, right? So we imagine that this comes from puppetry, where the sutras, the puppet, acts according to the string attached to the fingers, etc. But he points out that Sutradhara is, in Sanskrit drama, the word Sutradhara is used, but puppetry was not there at the time. When Sanskrit drama was produced, puppetry was not there. It's a much later cultural phenomena. So it couldn't have come from there. So where does it come from? He says, the word Sutradhara must have meant, in their usage, like in Marathi and Gujarati, Sutar. In Marathi, Sutar means a carpenter, right? So he says Sutradhara in Sanskrit must have had the same meaning as a Sutar. Now, what is the significance of that? A Sutar is the one who prepares the stage. So Sutradhara is the one who prepares the stage. So in other words, he is the overall in charge of presenting that drama. He is in charge of presenting that. He is prepared the stage, whether literally or metaphorically, for the presentation. So, in that sense, like we hear about Greek drama also, the director was not only the author was not only the writer of the play, like Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, etc. We hear about them that they not only wrote the play, they actually wrote and performed. They got people to perform and they directed, etc. So, somewhat like that, the Sutradhara is actually the one who sets up the whole stage. So, see here that Marathi word sutar is the reason why he is able to, open our eyes to the fact that Sutradhara is not a puppeteer, but the one who sets up the stage, etc. So, therefore, I think it is very significant that these insights are very useful to be able to have these insights. One of the other contemporary scholars I know of, I don't know of all the scholars who that are there. G.N. Devi, for example, knows multiple languages, and I know that he has a lot of knowledge about Gujarati and Marathi literature plus English. So he is also a multilingual scholar. But there is also this scholar called Manu Devadevan. He is basically a Malayali, but he is very well versed in Kannada, Oriya, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, and in all these languages his scholarship is very, very deep. In addition to, of course, he writes in English extensively. He writes in 3 languages. Bilingual writers we very often come across. Trilingual, not even A.K. Ramanujan was trilingual, although he translated from Tamil, he did not write in Tamil. Whereas, Manu Devadevan, who was there yesterday, by the way, he writes in Malayalam, Kannada, and English. He's an excellent historian and also a great scholar of matters related to literature. So, and his familiarity with not only southern languages but also Oriya, and he knows classical Oriya also. So all this makes such people rare and their scholarship special because they are able to bring in an insight which is unavailable to us who only see through a very, very small aperture. I think having access to multiple languages and resources of multiple languages is having a very large aperture where you can see a large amount of space, so to say, if I have to use that emphasis. Now, so talking about the purpose is very important Also because it helps us in why did I translate this book? If I have a very clear purpose of translating this book, then it helps me in also deciding what to translate. So why did I translate the essays that I have included in this? There are 31 essays. Actually, I have translated more than that. I have translated more than 45 essays, and only 31 could be accommodated. As it is very, very large. Perhaps it's one of the larger volumes under this series that Penguin is going to bring out. It's in excess of 400 pages. So they were saying like, bus, aur mat bhejo, kind of a thing. So around, now, once I knew what the purpose of translating Kurtkoti was in my mind, I knew what I need to translate. Like I said, I wanted Kurtkoti, through Kurtkoti, I wanted, as a translator, I wanted to introduce to non-Kannada literature the intellectual resources available in Kannada literature, in Kannada literary criticism, I mean. So it is an introduction to Kannada literature, but more importantly, it's the introduction to Kannada literary criticism. So nearly 250 pages of this, they are essays of historical kind. Now, here again, there is something special about Kurtkoti. He is not somebody who engages in a traditional, in telling the traditional history. You know, even when he's giving you a historical view of Kannada literature, he's not doing it in a traditional chronological, presentation. It's very interesting to read his historical essays. Some of them I have collected here. 4 or 5 essays in this are of that kind, very long essays. What he does is to take up patterns that run through the entire gamut of Kannada literature. I don't know if in Marathi or in Hindi you have literary critics who give you such a breadth of view of the entire tradition from the beginning till now. That is the kind of, and such scholars are rare, I believe. So I don't know if Marathi might have somebody like that. If such scholars are there, I think they need to be introduced to the external, to the world beyond Marathi. People who will tell you the earliest writers and relate them even to the most recent writers. So, Kirtinath Kurtkoti has written about the first piece of Kannada literature available. The first piece. To the late 20th century, last decades of what is published in the last decades of 20th century. He died in 2013, so he did not have much time to talk about 21st century, but he has written up to the end of 20th century. So then, that's around more than from what, definitely from 9th century, perhaps earlier than 9th century to 20th century. It's very, very, and he writes with great insights into this entire, and then he's able to, show patterns of continuity across. That is why it is important. Now, this is also significant because using this idea of the continuity that you find in the literary tradition of Kannada literature, he argues that, see, there is a fundamental difference between the Indian literary tradition and the Western literary tradition, the Indian aesthetics and the Western aesthetics. And that is that Indian aesthetics lays greater emphasis on continuity, and Western aesthetics lays greater emphasis on, discontinuity. Or harmony is more important in Indian aesthetics, and contradiction and contrast and conflict in Western. So the way he facilitates a post-colonial perspective is very different from our international post-colonial scholars. Or even in Kannada, people like D.R. Nagaraj, who write more in the Western literary critical framework than, and their insight, post-colonial insights are very, very different from the post-colonial insights that are available here. One or two of them I'll mention here. For example, he talks about how D.R. Nagaraj himself has written. D.R. Nagaraj is another very important Kannada critic. He has also written in Kannada as well as English. Permanent Black, publishers Permanent Black, have brought out 2 volumes of his essays in the recent past. So D.R. Nagaraj has pointed out how he's all the time talking about conflict, and Kurtkoti all the time talked about harmony. And this is paradigmatic because Kurtkoti himself talks about how the Indian aesthetics is more about harmony, and you see that in Indian literature throughout. They are trying to, establish even beyond what he calls as krama bhanga, disruption of order, but re-establishing a new order. So continuity is important. Whereas in the Western aesthetics, it is conflict that's important. He explains this with another example. He talks about Sanskrit drama as against Western drama. In Sanskrit drama, he says, in Western drama, we have conflict. All of us are familiar with this, English studies people are familiar with this statement. Without conflict, there is no drama, isn't it? So, conflict is the soul of drama, according to the Western. It is actually Augustine who said it, not Aristotle, but it is as famous as Aristotle's own dictums on drama. Whereas, as against that, Kurtkoti points out, the Indian tradition focuses more on complete and incomplete characters. Rather than conflict, the focus is more on complete and incomplete characters, where incomplete characters are not bad. They're not villains. We don't have villains. We don't have tragedies and comedies simply because that is not the worldview here. And who is a complete character and who is an incomplete character? An incomplete character is one who requires another, maybe the opposite, to complete them. You think of Karna, you have to think of Arjuna, isn't it? You think of Bhima, you have to think of Duryodhana. So these are all incomplete characters according to him. Whereas Dharmaraja, Suyodhana, is a complete character because you don't need a pair to complement him. So I think that opens up a completely different way of understanding Indian literatures. This is the advantage of reading Kurtkoti. He's not a Sanskritist. He's not a nativist. He's not somebody who is, talking about Mera Bharat Mahan. He was an extremely critical reader, but very, very insightful. There was another thing I wanted to share. It's escaping my memory right now. Let me see if I have mentioned somewhere here. Something about one more, like this complete and incomplete characters. Something else. He talks about. He talks about how actors in post-colonial period, how in Indian drama actors act as against the acting in traditional performing arts. Even today, in performing arts such as dance and some of the other traditions of performing arts, we still have this approach to acting where the entire, all 4 types of acting, as they are called in Natya Shastra, the Angika Abhinaya, the Vachika Abhinaya, the Aharya Anubhaya, there are 4 types. All 4 are used. The verbal acting, the gestural acting, the costume, communication through costume, communication through gestures, communication through what is said, and communication through one mode, which I don't remember now. So all the four are deployed. You, for example, go to a Bharatanatyam performance. You go to a Yakshagana, what is called as Yakshagana in performance. You will see that in Kathakali performance, you'll see that they have all that. I remember seeing Macbeth being performed in Kathakali style. Macbeth. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen a Kathakali performance, not necessarily in person, I haven't seen, but on YouTube I have seen. Kathakali is a form of dance in Kerala in which there's elaborate, costumes and highlighted eyes and all that, and the actor, through the facial expressions and some mudras and some movements, he would tell the story. Just imagine telling the story of Macbeth through only doing, eye movements only, and some hand movements and some face movements. It's available on YouTube, you watch it, and this is something that is very, very interesting. So he talks about how repetition of certain mudras, how use of certain ways of acting, dance, music, and abhinaya all contribute to producing a rasa. Whereas, under the colonial influence, after being converted to realism, that's my word, that's not Kurtkoti's word, converted, I'm saying that because conversion has a negative connotation is the reason why I'm using it. We have been converted to realism, which has meant that for us now, like the Western aesthetics, Aristotelian worldview of art is mimesis. This framework West has struggled with, but it has primarily operated within that framework. Art as an imitation, and therefore it has to be real, right? Whereas Kurtkoti points out that is such a small way of looking at it. So he points out, for example, when the Parsi theatre started in India, they were the first ones to integrate the colonial influence in theatre. When Parsi theatre started, it started using techniques like, if there is a Mahabharat war or something, so when the arrow, the arrow has to travel. So they would show an arrow traveling from the Arjuna to Karna or whatever. So people, realistic. Dekho, arrow hi move ho raha hai. So people felt it's a great this thing, that special effect of the arrow. But he points out how, it takes the entire imagination out of your theatre experience. The audience are reduced to real in the sense that they are only expected to see what is realistic and not allow the audience its own imaginative participation in what is happening on the stage, which is the dimension of traditional performing arts in India, whether it is, and even in traditional literature, that dimension was there. So these are the points that he brings up as a distinction between the Indian and the Western approach. So these are all various reasons I am trying to give you to considering how writers like Kirtinath Kurtkoti, let me put it that way. I'm sure that is the case if we read good Bengali critics, if we read good Tamil critics, if we read good scholars in Hindi. I'm sure, Namwar Singh, for example, a very insightful Hindi scholar. And we need to be able to have access to these resources to enrich our perspective. I think this whole monochromatic, that doesn't mean that we need to be dismissive of other resources. It's not as if Kirtinath Kurtkoti was blind to the Western resources. In fact, he, compared to his contemporary, perhaps he was far ahead of all of them. In some of the essays, there is one essay that I have translated here called Speech and Writing, which would immediately resonate with many of you with what Derrida has written. And he's in implicit dialogue. He doesn't, mention names. There is no direct, he hardly mentions even what he quotes. So I'll come to that. But this is very important that he was open to Western scholarship, although he was all the time arguing quite explicitly sometimes, early on very explicitly, later on much more implicitly, that we should not be blind followers of Western aesthetics. Explicitly initially in the first work and later on more implicitly. But throughout his works you will come across traces of Western scholarship. You will have, no doubt Aristotle. You have him consulting Wittgenstein, he's consulting Barthes, he quotes people like I.A. Richards, and there is an essay in which he does something very, very similar to Barthes' essay on structural analysis, of sentence level understanding of literature. How we can understand literature. And he uses Sanskrit resources for that. He arrives at very similar conclusions as post-structuralism through the use of, Sanskrit scholarship, Sanskrit literary theories. Now, in Canada, many people have criticized Kirtinath Kurtkoti for his bias for, Sanskrit literary criticism, the classical. But I have discovered that it is not so much a bias. He is not saying that you use Sanskrit, but he has scholarship, he has familiarity with that, he is using it. But somewhat like him, we need to do the same with other resources available also, not only Sanskrit, but also other resources in our languages. We need to, operationalize it, I think, is the lesson that I could draw out of working on. Now, so to summarize my reasons for translating Kirtinath Kurtkoti, I think it is very, very eye-opening, it's very, very useful to train oneself by reading somebody like Kirtinath Kurtkoti, because it gives us access, as I've been saying repeatedly, to this multilingual kind of a scholarship available. Now, let me now turn to, if these are the reasons why I translated and what I translated, etc. Now let me turn to how I went about translating. Of course, to begin with, there was an ethical question. To translate Kurtkoti or not to translate Kurtkoti. I'll tell you why. Because Kirtinath Kurtkoti was an English lecturer. He taught in the English department of SP University, Anand. Sardar Patel University, Anand. Vallabh Vidyanagar, Gujarat. So he knew English. He taught English all his life. He wrote in English. He has written a few stray essays in English, but none of these essays that are translated, he wrote in English. He chose to write in Kannada, and remember that around the same time, the trajectory of Kurtkoti and trajectory of Girish Karnad meet. Kurtkoti, A.K. Ramanujan were not only contemporaries, they were very, very close associates. Kurtkoti and Ramanujan were working together in a college in Belgaum. And Karnad, of course, says that Kurtkoti was his mentor. Now, look at Karnad. He almost always translated what he wrote in Kannada to English. And some people say that he actually wrote in English and then translated to Kannada. I don't know what is what. And similarly, Ramanujan always wrote in English as well. In fact, he wrote perhaps more in English than in Kannada. He has written a lot in Kannada, but a lot of his literary criticism are in English rather than in Kannada. He's written poetry in Kannada. And one autobiography. Or one text called as autobiography. I don't know if it is an autobiography. It is called Another's Autobiography. It has been translated to English. Now, by somebody else. Now, contrary to these people, or contrary even to somebody like U.R. Anantamurthy, who also wrote extensively in Kannada, but also wrote in English, Kurtkoti chose not to write in English. He must have his reason, no? So is it ethically right to, translate him? Was one of the questions that I had to deal with at the outset. But then, if you read Kurtkoti's writings, you can't help but feel that this is something that others also should read, should be able to read. Even people who don't have access to Kannada also should be able to read this. So I felt that if I want non-Kannada readers to have access to Kannada's literary criticism, to Kannada literature, know about Kannada literature, also know Kannada literary criticism, then nobody better than Kirtinath Kurtkoti, so I wanted to translate. So this is how this ethical question I tried to deal with. Then that leads me to some technical aspects of translating Kurtkoti. See, when I first began translating, my first couple of essays that I translated, I thought, it's very easy to translate them. It's no big deal. First of all, I am not one of those who think that, who believe in the believe in this idea of what is lost in translation. People talk about lost in translation, that what is there in the original hasn't come through. I remember an exchange between somebody in the audience and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak when she had come to the University Department of English, Pune Institute, many years ago. So somebody asked her this question, do you think that she has translated Mahashweta Devi into English, right? In connection with that, the question was asked, do you think that Mahashweta Devi, because she is this kind of a writer, that kind of a writer, do you think that she can be translated effectively to English? Some question was asked, something to that effect. And many of us, when we talk about translation, get stuck at this. But Marathi mein iska matlab aisa hai, English mein aisa hai, kind of a thing. We always feel that in English translation, it doesn't have the same effect as it has in the original language. So she said that, something like this comes from what did she say? She has this very, very nasty language sometimes, and she used something like that. She talked about the arrogance of mother tongue, or some such expression she used. I can't remember the exact words, but she said this comes from an arrogance of mother tongue, where we think that only our language is capable of telling something, not other languages. So I am not somebody who believes in this idea of lost in translation. I don't think there is anything called as lost in translation, because first of all, any translated work, as people who may have been working in the field of translation studies would be familiar with this argument. It's not my argument. It's been there in translation. Many scholars have made this argument, that translation is never really a translation of the original. It is always a new work. It's a new work. So this is a new work in a way. So once we accept it's a new work, Or, as Derrida says, it's a new interpretation. It's an interpretation. Translation is an interpretation. If we accept that it's an interpretation, then there is no problem. Because there are other interpretations possible. One possible interpretation is what. But once it is translated, it has its own journey, isn't it? It has its own, resonances, which may be very different from that of the original text. And that is precisely what Benjamin had in mind when he talked about the afterlife, of translation. Now, so when I first translated a couple of essays, I thought it's very easy. But then I began to realize that what has happened with, like everything with Kirtinath Kurtkoti, there is something very, very subtle about his writings. So when I translated into an English that I knew, and that was academic English. I'm, unlike some of you, I'm not a convent-educated person. I have, like some of you, I have come from a Kannada medium school background, and English is in a way an acquired language for me. So, and because I have acquired this language in the academic context, my English is primarily academic. So, for example, if you ask me something about cooking or something, I may not be able to answer in English. And sometimes I forgot to thank them because they're the ones who are facilitating all this YouTube business. Sometimes in the department, we slip into talking about recipes and stuff, and very often I run out of words in English. Now, so my English is primarily academic English. So I was translating Kurtkoti into academic discourse. Before long, I realized, and a couple of friends with whom I shared this also pointed out, that I'm missing the tone. The tone of Kurtkoti is missed, which is very important, because there is a reason why he did not write in academic Kannada. D.R. Nagaraj, another very, very, somebody whom Ashish Nandi has called as one of the most important non-Sanskritic mind intellectuals, D.R. Nagaraj. But D.R. Nagaraj belongs to the academic discourse. He wrote in that academic discourse. He wrote in Kannada. He wrote a little bit in English also, but primarily he wrote in Kannada. And what he wrote was in that academic discourse. What is academic discourse? Academic discourse is a discourse which is primarily Western, and it has logical, teleological kind of a style. It is written in a particular, cause and effect, logical and argumentative prose style. Kurtkoti did not use that. Kurtkoti had chosen, irrespective of his education, similar to our education, mind you, he also did MA in English. But contrary to that, he chose to follow the writing style. When he wrote literary criticism, he chose to write. He also wrote poetry, by the way. He wrote plays, and he has written a novel. In addition to all this, he has written several plays, one novel, and a collection of poems. His first published work was a collection of poems, and second work was a collection of plays. And then later on, he has also written a novel, which was published after his death. So, when he wrote criticism, he chose a language which took him closer to what is known as Vyakya, Tiku, and these are from Sanskrit's, discourse. And there is a discourse called Talamaddale in Kannada. Talamaddale is a performing art. But it's a performing art like, I don't know if you have heard of Yakshagana, which is a dance drama, based on usually the epics, but also sometimes have stories taken from contemporary or folk, themes, folk stories are performed as Yakshagana. Talamaddale has similar to Yakshagana, except that it's not performed. It's people sitting and engaging in this delivery of lines from epics and interpreting them. It's a kind of a hermeneutic performance, where you really interpret the epics. And that is also a style that we find in his writing. So considering that Kirtinath Kurtkoti wrote in such a style, it was perhaps inappropriate, it would have been inappropriate had I translated to the academic language. So this was one of the issues that I had to keep in mind. Secondly, he wrote in Kannada, except perhaps his first collection of essays. In his later writings, I've taken a lot from his later writings, he uses very short sentences. Most of the sentences are simple sentences or short sentences. But in English, I had to change that. I'll tell you why. See, in Kannada, he was writing for a reader very different from the reader that I thought I will be having. Although it is published by Penguin, I don't think this book is going to be read by too many general readers, like the kind of readers that Penguin has for its fiction titles. I'm surprised that they have a non-fiction title. Usually they don't have non-fiction, especially of this kind, literary criticism and stuff. They have biographies, autobiographies, and anything that sells, churmuri, but not something like literary criticism. So even irrespective of Penguin publishing it, I don't think this will be read by too many general readers. It will be read mostly by people from the field of English studies, academic readers. So knowing this, I needed to be very, very particular, and I needed to, be able to communicate to that and cater to that readership. So I decided to, find a middle path where it doesn't become completely academic, nor does it completely loose upon the academic reader. So I kind of very often chose what sounds better in English. In English, you don't speak in a very, very elaborate manner. You are concise. Stating something very concisely is one of the features of expressivity in English. So therefore, rather than his many sentences which are short, I had to kind of abridge them and make them into complex sentences. And secondly, I had to make peace with the fact that a lot of humor, especially verbal humor and tone humor, are lost. Because trying to bring that across would have required a lot more, footnotes and elaboration and parentheses and all that, which would have distracted the reader from what is being said. When we write, there is this snide remarks which we are able to make with just an inflection in the language, or with one small little word, or in the tone in which, or a particular choice of the phrase or muhavra or things like that. And there is an element of humor which is verbal humor, where just because of the use of the word, the humor is communicated. Though these are things that those of you who have translated will know, we always have very big difficulty when we are translating. So I had to make pace with that. Another similar strategy in translating was that, when Kurtkoti writes, he's writing for the Kannada audience, and if he takes, say, for example, the Rabindra, he doesn't have to mention who is the Rabindra, because everyone knows. If he says Kuvempu, there is an author called Kuvempu. In Karnataka, everyone knows Kuvempu. If I say Kuvempu, it will not make sense to you. Then I'll have to say who Kuvempu is. Now, that was another, because there are so many authors he kind of keeps referring to. Even though he's talking about one, he will be talking about 10 other writers. Then at least in the first use, I have to give information. Now, in academic discourse, what do? We give, star and footnote, etc. But, it is a kind of an invasive, footnotes are invasive upon our reading experience. It is very distracting, if every time I have to go somewhere else and check what that is, and even if there is only a star, I have to, there is a star, what to do with the star? You feel compelled to go and check, otherwise you feel that you haven't really understood it. So I decided that I will insert additional information within the sentence. So if there is, say, for example, Kuvempu, then within the sentence I will say the famous Kannada writer or some such, modification I insert, so that the reader doesn't need to, go anywhere else to find out. So what I'm trying to say is that for me, original is not important. The translated text is important, because my reader is a monolingual reader. I am translating for a monolingual reader, not for a multilingual reader. I'm not translating for Kannada. This is from Kannada, so I'm not translating for Kannada. If I'm translating from Marathi, then I'm not translating for the Marathi reader. I'm translating for somebody who doesn't know Marathi. So, in the language in which I'm translating, say English, it should become an independent English poem, independent English essay, etc. And there has to be the reading experience in English of this essay has to be without distractions, without disruption. So, because I aim, whenever I am engaged in translation, at clarity and accessibility to the monolingual reader, I did this. And similarly, when he quoted from poetry, when he is talking about ancient Kannada literature, as you can imagine, all of them are verse. And there he is quoting a verse line. Now, if I translate that into an equivalent English verse, I have done on few occasions, then, getting the English verse and all that is complicated. So, some people feel that, if it is a verse, meaning not a free verse, meaning, rhyme, rhythm and all that, then translation also should follow that. So they will do whatever circus required to, insert rhyme. For no rhyme or reason, they will insert a rhyme. I don't subscribe to that. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm simply saying that I don't subscribe to that viewpoint. I feel that in English it should make sense. So, as far as this is concerned, literary criticism is concerned, I chose to stick to sense than, style. So, I need to, get across the meaning. More importantly, I felt when I'm doing literary criticism, not poetry, mind you. So therefore, many of the poems that he quotes, I have, given the prose equivalent of that. Now, finally, I'm sure the time is, I have taken more time than I should have, but finally, very briefly, let me talk about for whom do I translate. Now, this is an important question simply because, and it's also an important question, not in general, but also in particular to Kirtinath Kurtkoti, because Kurtkoti's reader and the reader of this translated text, are they same? Is the first question. Of course, language is different, but in Kannada, the readership that Kurtkoti had, and in English, the readership, the translated text is likely to have. So I had to deal with that question. I had to try and understand this. And this has something to do with the style of Kurtkoti. Kurtkoti, in fact, wrote very little compared to how much he talked about literature. You know, he would go to any college, any school, anybody who invites him, he would go there and talk about literature. People say that wherever you stop him, he would be ready to talk about literature. That was the amount of enthusiasm he had for talking about literature. Not that he wasn't interested in anything else, but whatever he spoke about, social problem, cultural issue, political issues, he will talk about, but through literature. That was his approach. There is one essay which is not there in this, from this thing where he talks about an instance of, somebody from his, in the apartment house that he was staying in, Vallabh Vidyanagar, the case of a house, another apartment, there the daughter-in-law was burnt alive, and how the person continued to live, without showing any, remorse, showing no guilt, nothing. They lived as if it is very. So he talks about this experience in a very, very interesting manner. So what I'm trying to say is that all this he does through literature. It is not a separate political treatise he's writing. It's not a separate social criticism he's writing. It is literary criticism. But this literary criticism that he writes, and especially when he talks, it assumes a reader, an audience, who are as much familiar with the literary works as he is. Like, for example, he doesn't ever mention the sources of his quotations. He doesn't say Kumaravyasa says this, or he doesn't say Bendre says. He simply quotes. It is your problem. Ye Kalidasa, whether it is from Kalidasa or Bhasa or Bhaubhuti or of course, on the basis of this is Sanskrit and this is old Kannada, this is medieval Kannada, this is modern Kannada, this much we can make out. But who it is from is your call. But why does he do this? Is it because laziness? No. Like in Talamaddale, like in many, Vyakyas, this is a part of that kind of writing, that discourse takes it for granted that the reader is familiar. There in Sanskrit aesthetics there is this word sahridaya. So for Kirtinath Kurtkoti, literary criticism is a sahridaya samvada, a dialogue between sahridayas. Who is a sahridaya? Sahridaya is basically the word sahridaya, sahridaya, right? Somebody who is similar to you as such. But basically in what? Similar to you in the sense, he is as much read as you. So for him, his reader and he are on the same level. The reader, it is like that in conversation. When you are sitting and conversing, right, unlike in this mode of, one person, looking in one direction and others looking in another directions, that happens in formal lecture method. Whereas when we are conversing, we are all on the same level as such, right? That is sahridaya actually. The relationship there is sahridaya. Where we assume, we take it for granted, the other's familiarity with what one is talking about. So he takes that for granted. That his readership also knows Kalidasa, that his readership knows this particular passage, this readership knows Bhasa's works or Bendre's works or Harinarayan Apte's work or Bankim Chandra's works, etc., etc. So he doesn't he doesn't try to educate the reader. He doesn't try to educate the reader. He's engaged in sharing that enthusiasm, literary enthusiasm with the reader. Not in educating the reader, not in evaluating the works. See the subtle difference in the very concept of literary criticism here. In English literary criticism, these are implicit. Education is an inevitable aspect of literary criticism in the Western concept of literary criticism. It goes right back to Plato, as all of you know. But Kirtinath Kurtkoti's practice of criticism reminds us that there is a completely different approach where it is sahridaya. The reader is not, an ignorant person. Whereas Plato, Aristotle assume that the reader is ignorant and therefore in need of being educated, and therefore literature has to, function as a means of education. But for Kurtkoti, the Indian tradition takes it for granted that the other is also as educated as the self is. So the self and the other in Indian aesthetics has a completely different, relationship than Western aesthetics. I think these are subtle things that we had to begin to notice. So in translating Kurtkoti, I had to keep in mind that he is translating to a Sahridaya. But my translated texts are not likely to be a Sahridaya. Why? Because he's talking about a lot of Kannada and Sanskrit literary texts. Of course, being about Kannada literature, there is a lot of Kannada literature, and which unlikely to be the case. Many of them have not even been translated. So I had to keep that in mind. Okay, that I'm translating it not to a Sahridaya, to somebody who is familiar with it. So I had to use a different tone. I had to use a different kind of a language. So secondly, therefore the reader of my text is somebody who is unfamiliar with the literature that Kurtkoti is, referencing. Now, there is a word that Kurtkoti was very fond of using, and he imagined literary criticism to be harate. Now, this thing that I was earlier talking about, what happened on the attic of Manohara Granthamala, the literary conversations, he called it harate. Harate basically means casual conversation. When you sit and yap, it is harate. But he developed that into a kind of a intimate literary conversation. Doing harate on yapping about literature is a very, very intimate way of sharing the literary experience one has had. Now, that is the kind of style that I wanted to, aim at. I'm not claiming that I have been successful. Far from it. I'm sure you will point out, if you read some of the essays at least, this is very, not a harate, it's a little difficult. But that is what I was aiming at. So I deliberately avoided academic discourse and tried to approximate. If possible, I would like to refine that kind of a language and be able to, reach a kind of English prose, which can accommodate Kirtinath Kurtkoti in the future, where, like his Kannada, in English, we are able to make literary criticism an intimate sharing, an intimate but also passionate sharing of literary experience. So that is, in short, not really short, more than an hour, what I have to offer about my experience of translating this book, Courtesy of Criticism. Thank you all for your patience. I know it has been a very long lecture. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
So, can we have a small question?
Yes, definitely.
Anyone who would like to ask a question? The student go first.
While translating his work into English, you might have felt some personal contradictions or disagreements while translating. So did you feel so, and how did you overcome?
Very good question. When I first started translating Kurtkoti, even before began this project, I had read Kurtkoti's works, and by and large, being a student of English literature, having been trained in English studies, in English literary criticism and all that, by and large, my training has been, like all of you, the Western tradition of English literary criticism. My exposure to Indian aesthetics is even today limited. Being the case, when I first, even before I started translating, when I had read Kirtinath Kurtkoti earlier, I always felt that, this guy is prejudiced, he's basically a classical scholar and, has only patience for Sanskrit and is hankering after Sanskrit, etc. People like D.R. Nagaraj have gone on record saying that he lacks social consciousness, and not only him, some of the others also. So that was a point of dissonance that I had. I was conflicted about translating Kurtkoti. It wasn't a project that I easily took it up when Ashoka University asked me to do this. Initially, I had this. I would have liked to do somebody like D.R. Nagaraj, who fits in with my ideology quite easily. But I'm happy I didn't do that. There are two reasons for that. One is a slightly complicated reason, so I'll not go into that. The second reason is this, that Kurtkoti is not merely a classical scholar. His resources were Sanskrit, but his template was not Sanskritist. I want to make that distinction. Okay, I know only Marathi doesn't mean that I'm only for Marathi, isn't it? I know Marathi. I don't know, say, German language. Does it mean that I'm against German language? No. Right? So somewhat like that, his area of specialization is Sanskrit. Let us put it this way. He doesn't have as much, let us say, expertise in folk or non-Vedic, traditions, etc., which many critics have objected. But okay, but I realize that we can do, if I have expertise in folk, I have expertise in, let us say, some other tradition, non-Vedic tradition, some Prakrit tradition, Dalit tradition, feminist tradition, this and that and the other, I should do something that he is doing using Sanskrit resources. Developing non-monochromatic lens of study. That's how I would put it. There is a student of mine, Ankshita. She's trying to write what it means to do a literary history from a multilingual point of view. Very difficult project. One of the credible ways of doing that, I felt, is Kurtkoti's method. Of course, Kurtkoti's method needs to be complemented by bringing in much wider resources. So yes, I had my difficulties initially, but I was able to learn in the process of translating. I was able to learn a lot and open up my own, little brain bit and be educated. So that doesn't mean that I have resolved all my difficulties with him. I still have some difficulties. I have some dissonance with Kurtkoti. I have some ideas. For example, I told you from nearly 7th century to 20th century, he has written extensively about Kannada literature and perhaps 1 or 2 essays on women, which screams about the lopsidedness of his scholarship, in a sense. Seen from that perspective, why did he not write more about feminism? Why did he not write more about women's literature? Because in all these periods, there were a lot of good, very good, Similarly, he wrote about the, a number of areas he did not cover. So the exclusions in Kurtkoti always raise a question mark, no doubt about that. But that doesn't disqualify Kurtkoti, is what I feel. Thank you. It was a good question.
So there are two questions.
Yeah.
From the online communities. So the first question is from a student called Kushi Prasad. She says, she asks, sir, you've worked across multiple languages, Kannada, Marathi, Hindi, English. How did multilingualism shape your perspective on literature?
Well, that is another very good question. Maybe if I speak honestly, my answer should be that I hope multilingualism, I hope I am able to be shaped by multilingualism. I don't think I am so far, I have been able to make my multilingual life, shape my understanding of literature or my approach to literary and other studies. So I think our study of the society, our study of the culture, our study of our political life, our study of literature, all this is better served if we are able to bring in a multilingual, comparative multilingual approach, because I think that definitely adds a certain layer of complexity in our understanding of issues. But honestly speaking, I can see that it is something that Kurtkoti is able to do, but Kurtkoti makes me understand that this is something that I haven't been able to do. So yes, it is something that I would like to learn rather than it has already shaped my perspective.
So one more question. This question is from Narendra Gauri sir. He says, sir, I would like you to highlight how Kurtkoti reflects in one of the essays, simplicity of Vachana and its category as utterances. It is from the essay Vachana, Language and Structure.
Yeah, what Narendra Gauli is referring to is a form of Kannada poetry, medieval Kannada poetry, 12th century Kannada poetry called as Vachanas, and the simplicity of Vachana. Actually, Vachanas are not simple. There is a widely held belief that they are simple. All you have to do is to read one Vachana of Allama Prabhu and explain it to me. They are not simple. They are mystic poetry, and all mystic poetry is complicated. So they appear to be simple because they make use of non-Sanskritic language. The images they use, the words they use, they are not Sanskritized. For example, Vachana, this is a movement from 12th century. 1100 to around that time. One of the earliest of them is called Jedara Dasimaya. He's supposed to be 11th century, late 11th century, and he's supposed to be, I think, a cobbler. He was the first one to write Vachanas. And Vachanas are an instance of bhakti poetry. As you're all familiar, bhakti poetry, which we have ample tradition in Marathi also, is about a certain kind of a theological approach also, but also a social approach, as we see in Tukaram, for example. Now, bhakti poetry engaged with non-Vedic, non-Sanskritic view of theology and spirituality, and they they tried to make the whole idea of spirituality something related to day-to-day existence. So, for example, these they were all laborers or craftsmen. So you have poets. There were as many as 30 to 40 or more women poets from different castes, from a prostitute to cobblers to what do you call those bamboo boxes? What are they called? बैम्बू का बॉक्स रहता है ना जिसके अंदर तो आप रोटी वगैरह रखने के लिए यूज़ करते हैं, या basket makers, basket making profession, all kinds of potters and all kinds of professions, all kinds of. So there were upper caste, there were lower caste, all that. Of course, as I was telling in that lecture that we had long ago, that entire movement, it was part of a movement called Kalyana movement, and the whole movement came to a violent end, apparently. I mean, these are all history about which there are different kind of presentations. So one such, there are people who contest this also, but one generally held view is that it came to an end when an upper caste girl married a lower caste boy, and that there was a repercussion and there was a huge violence when all the members of this group had to leave the capital city of the Bijjala dynasty and had to run away. This is one story. So this is largely held story in the progressive minds of Kannada literature. So yes, to specifically answer Naren's question, no, Vachana is not that simple, but it is believed to be simple because it did not follow the Vedic and the Sanskritist framework. It used day-to-day language of the kitchen, language of potters, language of workers in fields, so on and so forth. So because it drew from those languages, it drew images from there, it drew phrases and words from there, they come across as very simple. But if I sit to translate, then I see, kitna difficult. Because, you have to translate not only the words, but you have to translate the ideas. Their what you call their spiritual ideas, their mystical ideas, etc. So it becomes a little complicated. So, yes.
If there are no more questions online, then I would like to ask one.
Yes.
You've talked about exclusions made by Kurtkoti. You've also talked about his criticism being a little lopsided. I mean, this is a kind of telling in hindsight.
Yeah.
You've also talked about Kurtkoti's method of talking to a Sarudaya, his approach. Okay. So now, once this project is complete, it has come into a book form. I would like to ask you, what is your feeling or let's say reading of your own project? Whether you have revisited Kurtkoti, rewritten him, or you have simply translated? Because there are some, if Kurtkoti is not acknowledging the sources of various quotations, then it means that it's just not a simple task of translation, right? You should also, as a translator, know a little bit more about all the references. So, how would you like to describe this project?
Yeah. So, see, in the course of translating these essays, I had to consult a lot. So in a way, it's a kind of a collective effort, because I consulted many Kurtkoti experts. I consulted Sanskrit scholars. I consulted scholars in Old Kannada. I had to keep sending them WhatsApp this thing. Please explain this. Please explain that, etc. So, and asking where could this be from. Of course, internet helped a lot. I could kind of feed in and look the sources, many of which were available. But in many instances, I had to locate the sources by asking friends or using internet. I had to ask for explanations to those quotations, because some of old Kannada I'm not so conversant. I'm again in Sanskrit also. I understand a little bit, but one needs a little more than just understanding. So I had to consult the Sanskrit experts to get a sense of what it all is. So that was there. But I think a more serious question, if to take your question even at another level, is that he not only doesn't refer to the quotes he makes. So all these consultations can handle that, but he doesn't follow even the method of giving us what we call as literature review. Right? See, even in Indian tradition, there is something called as Purva Paksha. Purva Paksha is first present what about that subject, what people have so far talked about, other scholars so far have talked about. First, that is called as Purva Paksha. You have to present that, what has already existed. That's what we do now in literature review section of our thesis and all that. So, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't bother about what other scholars have to say. He talks only about his own. This is a problem, methodological issue. So one has these kinds of issues also with him. So, and also, I said, there's a lot of comparative, element in this, but all these comparative elements come from classical sources. His enthusiasm for classical literature, sometimes, that's another area where I had difficulty. It becomes irksome because he doesn't look at anything else. So these are problems that one would come across. One, of course, should be thankful to what he has to offer. With these kinds of reservations, one would continue to have. After translating Kurtkoti, I have gone back to this book for various reasons. First of all, to take stock of what I have tried to do here, and also to try and understand these essays better. And I have begun to understand them, in fact, much better now. After having completed the translations, I'm now getting able to kind of put together a number of things, add them up, so to say. So that yes, there is much more to be translated of his work. So going back to Kurtkoti is, I think, going to be an ongoing process.
Explanation about how you decided or how you rather chose the essays to be...
Yes, like I said, I had a very simple criteria. I wanted to introduce Indian language literary criticism to non-Kannada readers. So I wanted to introduce Kannada literary criticism to non-Kannada readers. Why? As I was saying earlier, I think it's a big, blank space in our academic life that we have become monochromatic. We don't consult our multilingual resources. So that was the starting point. And Kurtkoti enters there. Now, why does Kurtkoti fill up this blank for me? Because Kurtkoti is somebody who has practiced it. So, before coming to Kurtkoti, I had, kind of floundered into this idea that, it began with my long engagement with English studies, where, English studies is very, very, how shall I put it, very, very one-sided. It's very one-sided. And it's also something that ignores the multilingual repertoire of the students. Students come with such rich cultural resources, all of which is negated in our education system. We tell the students, whatever you know of your literature, whatever you know of your cinema, whatever you know of your, other cultural resources, maybe bhajan, maybe your religious stories, and all that is irrelevant in the English classroom, is what we do. Or even in Marathi classroom, I am afraid. So against this background, I had been toying with these ideas that we need to operationalize the existing repertoire of the student. They already have cultural resources. Some of them have very, very refined and very advanced cultural resources, but they don't happen to be Western. They don't happen to be, quote unquote, something that fits into this education system. But we are completely, rejecting it. And then we are telling them, learn this, learn this, learn this. And obviously, we end up in a situation where, student always comes across as dumb. You remember this Aniket's essay on the subaltern students, that the effect of the subaltern students that he is describing is this. The subaltern student, a student is made subaltern by the system. So student is not a subaltern by himself or herself, not because of identity category. I come from a village, therefore I am subaltern. No, I come from a village, I may be very, very rich, isn't it? It would be inappropriate and politically wrong and factually wrong to say that because I belong to XYZ caste, which is socially oppressed, therefore I am a subaltern student. No. I am economically poor, therefore I am a subaltern student. No. Because in education context, that is not a criteria. In the education context, I would like to believe one is subalternized. One is not a subaltern student, one is subalternized. In the sense, one is marginalized in the classroom by the system, by saying that what you know is of no use. So, if we need to operationalize the cultural resources of students, then when I started thinking in that direction, that's when I kind of bumped into Kurtkoti's methodology of bringing in a multilingual, comparative way of doing literary criticism. So I thought that is definitely something that would be useful. Therefore, I, made that my criteria. I need to offer to non-Kannada readers literary criticism in Kannada, which introduces to them, number one, Kannada literature, number two, literary criticism. So that has been the basis. Of course, this is not even 10% of what he has written. He has written extensively. He has one whole book on Sanskrit drama called Pratyabhijnana, very important book. It has been translated, of course. It has been translated by somebody called K. Raghavendra Rao. It's available. Sahitya Academy has published it. I did not translate that because that is about Sanskrit scholarship. He has one book on English romantic poetry called Romanticism. I did not include any essay from that because I wanted, his works on Kannada literature. So that was my criteria. I kept it very simple that way. I wanted this book to introduce to non-Kannada readers Kannada literature and Kannada literary criticism for these purposes.
There is one more question.
Yeah.
Sir, Sadhan Yadav asks, how does the study of literature affect the person who has just started studying literature, or how literature changes the perspective of life according to you?
Okay, so this is not about Kurtkoti. It's according to me. I think studying literature can help us to be different persons, different people. Here I am reminded of what Derrida says about literature. Derrida says in an interview that Derek Attridge conducted, which is there in this book called Acts of Literature, edited by Derek Attridge, In that interview, to a question that Derek Attridge asks Derrida says that literature is a space where we come across the other. And I think that is one of the reasons why literature is very important. Because, I'm sure those of you who have read English literature have had a certain vicarious pleasure. There is experientially, reading English literature is very different from reading Marathi literature. Not because it is difficult, let's put that linguistic issue aside. Just reading a Dickens novel or a Conrad novel or some American writer, some African writer or some Japan, a writer from Japan or French writer or something. What happens to us? Because we are much more than when we read a Marathi novel or a drama. When we read something from some other culture, I think it opens up us to a completely different culture, the other as we call it. And that, I think, is precisely the function of literature. And this is something that Kurtkoti also discusses actually. So literature is something that helps us to grow as a person because it helps us to, expand our horizons, to understand others, to empathize with others. For example, when you read a poem, you are emotionally moved. Rasa is important because of that. It leads to that, emotional participation for somebody completely unrelated to you. It's happening to XYZ and you feel sorry for the person and you perhaps maybe eyes well up, etc. Like it happens when we watch a drama or a cinema, or it's very similar when we read a novel or a poem, etc. I remember reading a poem called The Song of the Cow when I was in 3rd or 4th standard. It was in the textbook. Okay, I was moving from 3rd standard to 4th standard. So I went to a relative's place and they gave me, in those days it was like that, right? I'm sure in your case also it is like that. Somebody who is senior gives you the textbook. You don't really buy the textbook. You take it from seniors. Like the same textbook goes through several generations. So during the vacation, so somebody gave me that, and I'm not saying that I would read the textbook in the vacation before the classes started. I said kuch nahi, but wo diya to I happened to read it, and this Song of the Cow I read, and I remember the textbook had the mark of my tears all through the year I studied it from. So the point I'm trying to make is that why does literature move us? The fact that it moves us is a sign of our growing. It's a sign of our growing because we are admitting the other into our fold of empathy. As long as we think only for ourselves, we become dangerous people. Like, a lot of people are very dangerous simply because they don't read literature. I think if we want to change the society, we must make all our rulers read literature perhaps. Because literature makes people a little empathetic. So that, I think, specifically would be my answer to Sadhana, that literature makes us empathetic, and that is the reason why reading literature is important. Yes.
So
What's your name?
Mahima.
Okay, Mahima.
So as you said that translation is more an interpretation. So it is possible that sometimes while translating we misinterpret or we misunderstand. So what did you experience that throughout translating this work? And a request to briefly summarize the 31 essays topics.
After listening to me for 1.5 hours, Mahima is still innocent that I can do anything briefly. Swati would know, and many of my students, or both of them were briefly my students, they know that Bhat sir doesn't do anything briefly. Anyway, I may not be able to, summarize these 31 essays, but let me answer your first question. Mistranslation or translation as an interpretation, therefore misinterpretation. See, there is this argument that all readings are misreadings. Have you heard? There is this argument that all readings are misreadings. It sounds very radical and something unacceptable. ऐसा कुछ नहीं है. It's very simple actually. देखो, तुम जब पढ़ती हो, when you read something, you read it from your point of view. You interpret the words, the image, the context, all that from your experience of the world. Right? I would have a different experience of the world. The same image might mean something else to me based on my experience. So for me, the same text has a different meaning. For you, the same text. So both of us read the same text, we have two different meanings. Yes or no? Interpretations. Which is a misinterpretation? That's where the answer is. So that is the reason why some of the critics are of the view that there is nothing called correct and incorrect reading. There may be correct and incorrect context of reading. Or we may argue about the required context of reading or more important context of reading, so on and so forth. There may be, but there is no reading that is in that sense misreading. So if you ask, then why do you give us wrong marks? Then whatever we write also should be correct. If that is the case, no, there I am clean bowled.
You read it in this context.